He's a professor at the Department of Meteorology in Stockholm University, and his research group explores the multifarious ways in which atmospheric dynamics from planetary wave scale to the motion of individual cloud droplets help to shape the past, present, and future climate. He does this using a combination of simple models, full complexity general circulation models, observational data analysis, etc. And about his curriculum, and it's a simple curriculum available. He did PhD in physics in 1998 and started his career as postdoctoral research at Danish Center for Earth System Science, and then he moved to Department of Geophysical Sciences, University of Chicago. Further, he was a lecturer of School of Mathematical Sciences in University College Dublin, Ireland. And then he, from 2011 onwards, he is a professor at the Department of Meteorology in Stockholm University. So with this very short introduction, we are privileged to have you here for the 77th Ananthakrishnan Colloquium. Over to you.
Great.
One second,
should I go up here or should I stay down here?
Yes, more convenient.
It's more convenient, yeah. Okay.
Pramod?
What's the significance of the tree back there?
The significance of the tree, senior number. Just aesthetic. Aesthetic.
I thought maybe it had some symbolic meaning.
Can make a story.
It's the tree of knowledge.
Tree of knowledge, correct. The next time when we ask somebody else, we say
Tree of knowledge.
new story.
You have to attribute. You have to cite me.
Yeah, recite your name.
So you can hear me? Still good? Still working? Good. Great. Well, thanks so much for the invitation to speak here. It's a real pleasure. It's my first visit to India and my first visit to ITM. I've heard a lot about ITM over the years. It's got a big international reputation. And so I'm very excited to be able to be here and speak and meet with you. I'm not particularly, my research interests cover a lot of things, but not specifically the tropics I've done some tropical work, but not recently. So I thought I'd present to you some more recent work, which touches on the problem of the Earth's albedo. Okay, so to set the scene, there is a interesting observed phenomenon, which is that the hemispherically averaged albedo is essentially perfectly symmetric. That means that of the 340 watts per square meter that are incident on the Earth on area average, 100 watts are reflected in the northern hemisphere and 100 are reflected in the southern hemisphere. Okay, hemispherically averaged. And that number is 100 in each hemisphere to observational precision, which is less than 1 watt per square meter. Okay, and every time they send up a new satellite mission that increases the accuracy, that symmetry is still observed. Okay, so it's a very, very, very tight symmetry. Okay, which is surprising since the two hemispheres are extremely different. Obviously, right? I mean, the northern hemisphere has very large land masses, a lot of orography. The aerosol loading is much higher than in the southern hemisphere, and so on. Okay, so you would expect that both in terms just by virtue of the difference in surface albedo, you would expect some difference in planetary albedo. By the way, planetary albedo means the total albedo, including the clouds and the surface, right? So it's just how much is reflected to space, right? But just the difference in surface albedo would lead you to expect some difference in the total albedo. But that difference isn't there. So it's a big question, like why? What is it? How is it possible that these two albedos are so precisely equal to each other. Okay. This slide just emphasizes the point I just made, that the surface albedo, well, the clear sky albedo is very different. Okay. So if you take your satellite measurements and exclude all points that in which clouds are recognized, so you focus only on the clear sky part, there is a big difference in the albedo. Okay, that's with the albedo being higher than the northern hemisphere. That's partly the surface albedo, which is higher than the northern hemisphere, but actually most of it is scattering from aerosols, because the the fact that there's much more land in the northern hemisphere means that there's also a lot more aerosols. There are many more sources of aerosols. Okay. So if the clear sky albedo is asymmetric, right, and higher in the northern hemisphere, then the only way in which you can obtain planetary albedo symmetry is by having the clouds be brighter in the southern hemisphere and compensate for the clear sky asymmetry. Okay. So in a recent paper by George Tatsaris and Bjorn Stevens, which was kind of the starting point for the project that I will describe in the rest of my talk, they looked at this problem in a bit more detail, and they realized that, so among the questions they asked in this paper was, to what extent is the, so the asymmetry is because of clouds, but is it cloud over land, cloud over ocean, or what, right? And so they did that partitioning, and they find that the cloud albedo, okay, is actually the same in both hemispheres over land, this is the green, and over sea ice, okay? I mean, the fraction of the area covered by land is different in the two hemispheres, but the cloud albedo is the same, actually, over the land, okay? Whereas over the ocean, the cloud albedo is actually greater in the southern hemisphere, okay? There's also a bigger amount of ocean in the southern hemisphere. But the really important point, the really big difference, is in the fact that the albedo itself, the cloud albedo over the ocean, is greater in the southern hemisphere than in the northern hemisphere, okay? So if you take a random square kilometer of ocean in the southern hemisphere, it's going on average to be brighter than an average square kilometer of ocean in the northern hemisphere, okay? Now, I was using this expression cloud albedo. What do I mean? I mean this, okay? In this work and in the rest of my talk, I will be using this quantity cloud albedo, which is defined as written here, okay? So F is the cloud fraction as observed from the MODIS satellite product, okay? And tau is the visible optical depth of the cloud.
So is there any symmetry, or is this some sort of?
This is annual average, okay? I can't tell you off the top of my head what the seasonal, we looked at that, but I'm forgetting now, yeah. So this is annual mean, okay? And the annual mean, it's very clear. There may be some seasonal. I have to get back to you on that, okay? Okay. So this is a simple parameterization of the intrinsic albedo of a cloud. Okay, it's a function of the cloud fraction, the amount of the fraction of the pixel covered by cloud, and the optical depth of the cloud. Okay, both these parameters, cloud fraction and cloud albedo, are available from satellite observations, and so we're going to use this number C as our main variable of interest in this talk, and that's what was used in this paper. So these numbers here are this C. Okay. Yeah. So what this tells you then is that the hemispheric compensation, so the hemispheric difference in cloud albedo, which compensates for the clear sky albedo, occurs over the oceans. Okay. Then the question is, okay, which oceans? Like where? At what latitude? Right. And so, you know, these are hemispheric averages, and over each hemisphere, there's a wide variety of different types of circulation, which are associated with a wide variety of different kinds of clouds, right? So this is stuff that you will be familiar with in the tropics. We have a Hadley-Walker cell, so you have ascent and deep clouds in in the convergence zones, and then, you know, low subsidence and low clouds over the subtropics. Okay, so that's a whole set of cloud families right there. And then as you move into the mid-latitude, you have mid-latitude cyclones, which are also associated with a broad spectrum of different cloud types. And then as you get into the polar regions, you have yet other types of clouds, okay, stratocumulus and stratus. So, you know, each of these clouds, you know, it could be any of these clouds that do the compensating. And so the question is which ones, right? And so a quick answer to that is that is given by this figure here. And what this figure tells you is that, well, let me say what's plotted here. What's plotted here, so this is latitude in each hemisphere, okay? And so the blue is for the northern and the red is for the southern hemisphere. And that's the zonal mean annual mean climatological cloud albedo for each hemisphere. So you're comparing directly the two hemispheres, latitude by latitude here, right? And so you see that latitude by latitude, there is no precise cancellation, right? So the latitude by latitude, the albedos are quite different, okay? But the interesting thing is that if you integrate over the tropical region, so from 0 to 30, the latitudinal differences actually cancel, right? So in a hemispheric average, the contribution to the hemispheric average that is coming from the tropics is 0, okay? Whereas in the high latitude, so kind of poleward of 50, okay, so this would be the the poleward edge of the mid-latitude storm tracks. In this region, you do have a difference that is not 0, okay, that doesn't integrate to 0, okay. So the conclusion is that the compensation, that is the cloud asymmetry that compensates for the clear sky asymmetry, is all coming from the high latitudes, mid to high latitudes, so from the poleward edge of the storm track. Okay, so this was the first thing that we found in this project, which kind of surprised us. Okay, so then there's the issue, you know, why does this happen? Okay, can we provide some at least proximate explanation for why these albedos are different? So why are the remember, this is ocean only, okay? So this means that the oceanic storm tracks in the northern hemisphere, for some reason, have less cloud than the oceanic storm tracks in the southern hemisphere, okay? Okay. So to start answering that question, we can, well, the first thing we can say is that the clouds in the storm tracks are generally going to be dominated by mid-latitude eddies, okay, cyclones and anticyclones, okay? So the characteristics of those eddies is going to influence the characteristics of the clouds, okay? So our hypothesis was that if we look at the different characteristics of the eddies, we might get some insight into the different characteristics of the clouds, okay? So to make that point, you can see that, so this panel here shows you the variance of the surface of the sea level pressure, okay? Which is a measure of storm track activity, okay? So the parts that stand out in red are the parts which have many eddies, so the storm tracks, okay? And the point here is that if you can visually relate this plot to this plot, which is the cloud albedo, and you can see that most of the cloudiness is indeed over the storm tracks, right? Actually, it's interesting that the tropics, where, you know, there's a lot of rain, at least sometimes of the year, and so presumably a lot of clouds, really don't have much cloud albedo, right? Much of the Earth's cloud albedo is in the mid to high latitude, okay? Okay, so if we believe then that there's some association between eddy activity, mid-latitude storm track eddy activity, and cloudiness, what can we do? Well, okay, sorry, I forgot that I put in this, just to go in a little bit into more detail about how cyclones are associated with clouds. Mid-latitude cyclones are associated with clouds in two main ways. Where you have, this figure goes all the way back to Bjerknes and Solberg, 1922, right? So this is the Bjerknes cyclone model. It's a sort of a classic of meteorology, mid-latitude meteorology. Bjerknes, yeah, just as a historical note, this Bjerknes was Jakob Bjerknes, who was quite young at this time. I believe this was Jakob Bjerknes. His father, Willem Bjerknes, was actually a professor in my university at the time when he published a paper in 1904 in which he said weather forecasting can be done by solving hydrodynamic equations, right? It was the first person, it was like new then that you could use mathematical equations to mathematically forecast the weather, right? Of course, he couldn't implement it numerically because that would have to wait, you know, some decades. But he was the first to say that it was feasible. Okay, so anyway, the typical characteristic of a mid-latitude cyclone is that you have a warm branch where, you know, warmer air from the subtropics moves towards the higher latitudes and rises typically. Okay, there's a warm front here, and so it rises over the warm front, and you get a whole range of clouds of different elevations along this rising branch. And then you have a subsiding branch, the cold sector, where the air is subsiding, and so you get a bunch of boundary layer clouds. You get low-level convection and a bunch of boundary layer clouds. Okay, so there's a whole host of upper and lower level clouds that are influenced by the cyclones. Okay. Okay. So what we did was quite simple. What Or Hadas, who was the PhD student who was working on this project, what he did was he took a cyclone tracking algorithm. Okay, this is I'm sure you'll be familiar with this, but let me just say what it is. So a cyclone tracking algorithm is just an algorithm that identifies features like sea level pressure minima, okay, in a snapshot taken from, in this case, Era 5 reanalysis, okay, recognizes those features and then recognizes them in each time slice and then connects them across time so that you can build up a picture of how cyclones are born, evolve, you know, how they move and where they die, okay? So you get literally storm tracks, the tracks of mid-latitude cyclones. And you can do that for cyclones and you can do that for anticyclones as well, okay? This picture here is for the cyclone. So once you have these tracks, you can extract data from, in this case, it was from, again, from MODIS. Okay, so you can extract a region of data from MODIS, which is centered on the place where the cyclone finds itself at that time, and then make composites, right? So that you get a typical cloud distribution around a cyclone. Okay, and then you can stratify that by metrics of cyclone intensity, right? So in this case, they're stratified by how deep the sea level pressure minimum is, okay? So weak cyclones means it's a shallow cyclone, so not very intense, and strong cyclones means it's a stronger cyclone with a deeper sea level pressure minimum, okay? And the obvious thing that stands out is that the strong cyclones, which have stronger circulation, also have more clouds, right? It's sort of intuitive, but you need to actually show that it's true, right? And I don't have the picture here to show you, but in fact, if you separate this into upper level, lower level clouds, then a large fraction of the difference is actually in the lower level clouds, okay? Although the high clouds also contribute, okay? You can recognize these are mostly high clouds, okay? And these are low clouds, okay? But if you take the difference between this and this, actually this difference here is quite important. Okay. And then you can say, okay, if I make a histogram of, those were composites, so it gives you sort of averages over many cyclones, right? But then you can ask him more specifically, how are these intensities distributed statistically? Okay, so you can make a histogram of the intensity distribution, which is what's shown here. Okay, so the blue is for the northern hemisphere and the red is for the southern hemisphere. And you can see that in the northern hemisphere, the cyclones, the distribution peaks at this is a metric of cyclone intensity. Okay, it's a sea level pressure anomaly. Okay, so the anomalies.
maximum or
it's the anomaly at the cyclone center.
at what time in the lifetime?
I think that's a good question. I think he did it for all steps in this. It's either all steps or the time of maximum intensity. But I actually can't. To be honest, I don't remember. Second question, I can't answer. Okay. One of those two. Anyway, I think it doesn't matter. I think whatever metric you take, you're going to get the same result, which is that the northern hemisphere cyclones have statistically weaker intensities than southern hemisphere cyclones. Okay. Key takeaway here is that these two modes are well separated. So southern hemisphere cyclones, on average, are stronger than northern hemisphere cyclones. Okay. And then if you bin the cloud albedo, you take the cloud albedo, so these same pictures here, okay, you average it over the box to get a box average cloud albedo, and then you bin those values, you average over each intensity bin, then you get the cloud albedo as a function of intensity, right? And that's, as was shown before, this is an increasing function in both hemispheres. Okay, in fact, the two functions are very similar in both hemispheres, interestingly. Okay. And so what it boils down to is just to saying that the southern hemisphere has more intense cyclones than the northern hemisphere on average. Okay, and therefore the albedo is typically stronger there in the southern hemisphere than in the northern hemisphere. Okay, so if you assume that most of the storm tracks is covered by cyclones, so these are only cyclones, his box is around cyclones, so it doesn't necessarily cover all the area. But if you assume that they cover a substantial fraction of the area, and by the way, you can repeat this with anticyclones and the same results apply, okay? Then you have basically explained why the northern hemisphere storm tracks have less cloud albedo than the southern hemisphere. It's because the eddies there are on average weaker and therefore produce less cloud cover and thinner cloud.
So it's not just on intensity, but also how many of them are. So you could presumably think of a case where these two distributions are similar, just have more cyclones in one.
Yeah, that's what I was saying about area coverage, right? So that's right. I mean, that is an issue. So I mean, how much of the area coverage? So that frequency issue is something that we didn't, or area coverage issue is something we didn't explicitly address in this study, and it is an issue. But I'm going to show you some more results from a different perspective that can address that question. Okay. Okay, so that's the first result, and this was published, yeah, in 23 already in PNAS. Okay, separately, in parallel with the study that I just presented, we did another study which of the same general question, but taking a completely different approach. Okay, this approach is the so-called cloud controlling factor approach. So what is that? The cloud controlling factor approach is essentially, yeah, as it says here, consists of two steps. Okay, firstly, you establish some relation between a local cloud property, okay, like cloud albedo, and some factor that you believe controls that cloud property, right? So, relevant cloud controlling factors could be, so the cloud in a certain place will probably be controlled by, the static stability in that place, by the temperature in that place, by the surface wind in that place, by, you can imagine a whole host of things that to control it, okay? So you can empirically build relationships between cloud properties and environmental controlling factors. If you think about it, this is exactly what we did here, right? This is a cloud property, and this is a controlling factor, right? In this case, we're just doing we're just establishing an empirical relationship between, in this case, eddy intensity and cloud albedo, right? But you can repeat the same thing with many other variables, right? So we did that. Okay, and once you have this relationship, you can look at the at any differences in the controlling factors, and from those differences predict what the difference in the clouds will be, right? So you go from clouds to controlling factor, and then you look at the change in controlling factor, and that gives you the change in clouds, right? So you are, in effect, explaining, at least statistically, the change in clouds through the change in controlling factors, okay? And the controlling factors are environmental things tied to circulation and climate dynamics that, as dynamicists, we might hopefully be able to understand and theorize about, okay? Okay, so we did that, and we did this point by point. So in the previous case, we were in the previous study, in the first study I discussed, we were looking at cyclone tracking and then taking averages over entire cyclones. Here we went point by point. So for each grid cell of the data set, and these are 1 by 1 degree cells that are available from the MODIS data set, okay? So for every 1 by 1 degree cell, we looked at the relationship between a whole host, like we looked at 6 different possible controlling factors, and looked at the statistical relationship with cloud albedo at the same point, okay? So it's point by point. And we looked at 6, but I'm only going to show you 2 because they're the ones that are most relevant, or the ones that work best, okay? And one is the surface wind speed, okay, and the other one is just the local SST, okay. So it's the same story again. Red is well, actually conveniently. So Joaquin Blanco, who was the postdoc working on this project, conveniently swapped the color convention. So now blue is southern hemisphere and red is northern hemisphere. But yeah, okay. We were all working together in the same project, but these 2 people decided to use the opposite color convention. Okay. Okay. So yeah. So what we find is that the northern hemisphere has weaker surface winds than the southern hemisphere. So the southern hemisphere has mean, the mean winds are around 10 meters per second and 5 meters per second. Okay. And the relationship between local wind speed and local cloud is increasing like this. Okay. So part of the difference between the part of the difference in cloud albedo between the northern and southern hemispheres is by this reasoning, due to the fact that the surface wind speeds are greater in the southern hemisphere, okay? Which is consistent with the fact that you have greater eddy activity. The eddies are stronger, right? At least intuitively consistent, okay? You have more eddies, a more active storm track, there's more eddy momentum convergence, and greater surface wind speed is one thing you can say, right? So that accounts for part of the difference. And the other part of the difference is just that there's a relationship between local SST, sea surface temperature, and cloudiness. Okay. And the sea surface temperatures are colder in the southern hemisphere than in the northern hemisphere. Okay. This is mostly because in the summer, the northern hemisphere can warm up quite a bit. Okay. Whereas in the southern hemisphere, you have upwelling. Okay, so the strong surface winds along the circumpolar current in the southern hemisphere drive up deep upwelling. So you have this deep upwelling going on all the time, and this keeps your surface temperatures pinned at quite low values, right, just above freezing actually. So you see this big peak. You see this big peak in SSTs at quite cold temperatures. Okay, okay. Whereas in the northern hemisphere, it's more of a kind of, there is no upwelling really in these regions, and so the temperatures fluctuate seasonally much more. Okay. Okay, and so this difference can also explain a good part of the difference in cloud albedo. Okay. So taken together, they explain actually 100%. Okay. Now this is just statistical. There's, I'm not. When I say explain, I mean statistically explain. So I'm not making any big mechanistic claims, but statistically, at least, you can explain all of the difference in cloud albedo between the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere storm tracks using these 2 numbers, these 2 controlling factors. Okay. How are these 2 approaches consistent, and how can we tie them together in a bigger, kind of more intriguing package? the one thing the way we conceptualize all this is the following. Okay, as I said before, there's a lot of ocean upwelling in the southern hemisphere, and this is sort of well understood. Okay, and this keeps the higher latitudes in the southern hemisphere cold year round, right? So it's kind of winter the whole year in the southern hemisphere. So this means that the baroclinicity is high. So the equator to pole temperature gradient doesn't vary much over the year. Okay. And so you know, whereas in the northern hemisphere you do have this seasonal variability. Okay. So in the summer the higher latitudes warm up quite a bit, baroclinicity is reduced, and you have weaker cyclones. Okay. So on an annual average, the cyclones are much weaker in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere, and that drives by the arguments I just said, that drives the difference. Okay, that drives stronger eddies in the southern hemisphere. The stronger eddies drives stronger surface wind, and you have the SST as a cloud controlling factor anyway. Okay, so all these effects are tied together. Okay. The big unanswered question is, so if we go back to the beginning, that cancellation between the asymmetry in cloud albedo and the asymmetry in clear sky albedo is very precise, right? It's sort of surprisingly precise. Whenever in science we see some precise cancellation, we always think, oh my God, this can't be just a happenstance, right? There must be some mechanism, some constraint that keeps that you know, we don't believe in coincidences, essentially, right? I mean, if we see a coincidence, there must be a reason, there must be a conspiracy. In a sense, we're kind of conspiracy theorists in science, right? What's the conspiracy that keeps these two things aligned, okay? And sometimes conspiracies don't exist, and you know, conspiracies don't exist, and coincidences do happen. But maybe there is a big constraint. Maybe there is some big climate dynamical mechanism that makes it so that the cloud albedo asymmetry is sensitive to the clear sky asymmetry, and this mechanism then ensures that these two things cancel out. That mechanism, we haven't found it. I'm just saying it's in, you know, it's a bit of a holy, within this particular subfield, it's the holy grail of this subfield, okay? And that mechanism, if it exists, needs to ensure that the forward flank of the storm tracks in the two hemispheres have information about each other. Okay, so thinking about that is difficult and still an open question. Okay, now how much time do I have left? So I can go until 4:20 or 4:20. I'm going to move on to a slightly different topic, actually a completely different topic, related to the first, but not to do with cloud. Yes, we have another paper on that. Yeah, actually, I could have included a slide on that, but yeah. So there's a follow-up paper looking at this in CMIP6, and the interesting thing is that the models are all over the place in terms of the planetary albedo. So they do not respect the symmetry of planetary albedo, actually. Okay, but they all show a cloud asymmetry. Okay, so they all show actually that the southern hemisphere clouds have a higher albedo than the northern hemisphere, but not enough to compensate for the clear sky. And so you have models that give a positive asymmetry in the planetary albedo and models that give a negative one. So they actually span the whole range. Okay. So that's a great point, because if there is such a mechanism, such a constraint, then it's not very robust. Okay, which actually makes you think maybe this is all just a coincidence. But you know. Okay, so moving on to a different topic. I'm going to stop talking about clouds now and just talk about surface wind. Okay, so another interesting. So as I said, so one of the points I made in the previous section is that the annual mean surface wind speed, which is shown here from a paper by Adam Monahan, 2006, and it's taken from a satellite-based data set. It actually blends a different set of satellite products that can directly detect surface wind. Okay, I won't go into the details there, but anyway, so far as we know, from the best satellite data available, the annual mean surface wind is much weaker in the northern hemisphere, in both basins of the northern hemisphere, than it is in the Southern Ocean. Okay, that was one of that. This picture is essentially the same. This picture, right? So this is the PDF over the storm tracks, over all of the storm tracks, and you can see that the means are different. So the mean is bigger in the southern hemisphere than in the northern hemisphere. Okay, that was just to show you the consistency between these two things. Okay. Okay, fine, good. But we already knew that the eddies are stronger. There's more baroclinicity, so we're all good. Now, if we go and look at the extremes of surface wind, okay, and but here by extreme I mean 98th percentile, okay, in the same data set, they're much bigger in the northern hemisphere, okay, especially in the North Atlantic, okay, but also in the North Pacific, okay. So this is really right. So these are PDFs that have a much weaker mean, but much fatter tails, okay. So the distribution is much more skewed. In fact, in this paper, he also shows the skew, and the skewness is much greater in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere. Okay, so that's interesting, right? I mean, these surface winds are produced by eddies, right? And so it tells you that in the southern hemisphere you have eddies that on average are stronger, right? And in the northern hemisphere you have eddies that are weaker, but sometimes they go crazy and produce like big excursions, big positive excursions, right? So that's a topic that I've been studying more recently together with a PhD student, Alexis Stankovic. I should have added his name here. Alexis Stankovic is the PhD student working on this project. And so we're trying to understand dynamical mechanisms that make it so that generate such extreme wind speeds starting with the northern hemisphere and then moving into the southern hemisphere. So he's only in his first paper now, well, second paper, and so he's only looked at the northern hemisphere. So we still have to look at the southern hemisphere. So now I don't have results for the southern hemisphere, so I can't actually tell you the complete story because that complete story is still to be done. But what I can tell you for the northern hemisphere is that if you so what we did here is, or what Alexa did is, he took over the northern hemisphere oceanic basin, the North Atlantic oceanic basin. He identified all the extremes of surface wind, okay, and then identified the cyclones that were associated with those extremes, okay. So we did the tracking thing, and so when you identify a surface wind extreme, there's a cyclone that's nearby. This is always true. There's always a cyclone nearby, and so we say that cyclone, is this surface wind extreme is attributable to this cyclone which is nearby. Okay, and then we take all those cyclones which have generated the extreme, okay, and make composites of those cyclone-centered composites. The center of the cyclone is where the green cross is, right? With some lag. Okay, so this is at the time when the surface wind extreme is achieved, and this is 1 day before and 2 days before. Okay, and the shading here shows the SLP anomaly associated with the cyclone, and these contours show the upper level jet stream. Okay, so if you do this, if you play this game with those cyclones that produce the extremes, which is the top row, okay, you see the evolution is such that you have a cyclone which is 2 days before the extreme surface wind occurs. You have a cyclone which is interacting with an upper level jet streak, okay, and it's in proximity of another cyclone which is pre-existing, okay. And over the course of these 2 days, the cyclone moves towards this pre-existing cyclone and merges with that cyclone, and that leads that is associated with an extreme. Okay, and then if you look at another family of cyclones, which are typical in the sense that they're well-established, mature, medium intensity cyclones, if you wish, but do not produce extreme surface wind speeds. Okay, these cyclones are quite different. In particular, they lack this. They're not. There's no sign of any systematic presence of a precursor or secondary cyclone. Okay, for it to interact with. Okay, you look at exactly the same picture again, so extremes on the top, typical cyclones on the bottom, but you look at it from an upper level perspective. So what I'm showing you here in the shading is the total potential vorticity, and the contours, red and blue, are the potential vorticity anomalies. Okay. You see that this surface cyclone that we saw before has a signature in the upper troposphere, which you expect, and it's tilted westward, so it's a baroclinic cyclone. So this is all quite, consistent with how we understand mid-latitude cyclones. But you see that there's this big, if you look at the absolute potential vorticity, there's this big extrusion of potential vorticity and a very tight potential vorticity gradient here, right? And you can, and I'm going to wave my hands here and make a sort of intuitive or sort of descriptive kind of argument, but you can associate some of this intrusion to the fact that you have, cyclonic circulation here, which is advecting PV southward and creating this big potential vorticity gradient, which is associated with the jet streak itself. Okay, and as the cyclone, as this extreme cyclone proceeds in its development, it interacts with this jet streak. You can't see the jet streak here, but you can see the strong potential vorticity gradient. It interacts with that potential vorticity gradient, undergoes explosive amplification, and generates extreme surface winds, right? Whereas for the typical cyclones, you see a reservoir of large PV to the north or forward of the cyclone, okay? But there's no mechanism to bring that PV further south and generate this high PV gradient. And so the development is less explosive, and you have a weaker cyclone with weaker surface wind, okay? So that's pretty much it. Basically, to summarize, so our idea is that in the North Atlantic, the way in which extreme surface winds are generated are by two cyclones meeting. Okay, and the role of the secondary cyclone, the pre-existing cyclone, is to advect PV equatorward and create a jet streak with which the incipient cyclone that will become an extreme cyclone interacts and allows it to amplify explosively, right? So then the question is to go, the next step in the project, which we haven't got to yet, is to look in the southern hemisphere, see if this kind of thing happens, and if yes, then why are the winds stronger in the northern hemisphere? But the hypothesis is that this does not happen in the southern hemisphere, or at least doesn't happen as often, and therefore you don't get these extreme winds as often. Now, why would that be the case? The fact is that in the North Atlantic, the circulation, so the cyclones are typically generated off the east coast of North America as they pass over the Gulf Stream and the strong baroclinicity there. And then they progress eastward, but often they recirculate, right? Because there's you often have sort of blocking circulations or anticyclonic circulation that generates some easterly flow at higher latitudes. And so these cyclones recirculate and often go back toward Greenland, okay? So you often run into a situation in which an incipient, a young cyclone is meeting an old cyclone that's in the end of its life cycle, okay? Whereas in the southern hemisphere, everything is much more zonal. So a cyclone is born in one latitude and then it evolves and then peters out. So it's much rarer for cyclones to meet each other. That's a hypothesis, and we're working towards actually seeing if it is true or not. So that's my summary. So mid-latitude storm tracks are on average stronger in the southern hemisphere, and it's associated with stronger surface winds and stronger cloudiness, and is associated with the asymmetry in clouds, which explains the asymmetry in planetary, or the symmetry in planetary albedo. That was one part of the talk, and the other part of this talk is that despite the fact that the surface winds on average are stronger in the southern hemisphere, the extremes are much stronger in the northern hemisphere, in particular in the North Atlantic. Okay, so I'll leave it there, and thank you for your attention.
Questions?
Thank you for this interesting talk. When we talk of cloud albedo, we are concerned about a couple of things other than the cloud properties. So, for example, if the same amount of cloud, if I put it in the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere, but the residence time is different. So that will impact albedo a lot. The second point is on an average, storms in the southern hemisphere are more poleward, and because of that, the incident solar radiation is more oblique, and that is causing more albedo. So these 2 points, I didn't find any mention of that.
Yeah, so to answer your first question, these are time averages, right? So even if the clouds have different residence times, right? On average, there's more cloud in the southern hemisphere. So even if they're shorter lived, it means that there must be some mechanism regenerating. I mean, so I can't directly answer your question. What I can say is that in the average, there's more cloud, right? So it overrides any residence time consideration.
Is that more brighter cloud? That whether it is time or because of the cloud properties.
Yeah.
It's not clear that whether it is because
they're brighter, but the brightness, I mean, the cloud albedo as defined here, contains cloud fraction is linear in the cloud fraction, right? So if you actually do a partitioning, the cloud fraction and the optical depth part contribute actually about equally to the asymmetry, okay? But anyway, the cloud fraction is important. So on average, the cloud fraction is bigger in the southern hemisphere, okay? So if the cloud fraction is bigger, then, well, maybe the residence time is less or more, but I don't know. But, the fact is clouds are more frequent, right? I mean, you observe at any time, and you're more likely to observe a cloud in the southern hemisphere than in the northern hemisphere, okay? And why that is a different question, and how that relates to, the factors, the dynamical processes generating the clouds and the microphysical processes controlling the lifetime of the clouds. That's a whole other, very complicated question, and you're perfectly right that it's an issue that one could study. But, I can observe that just clouds are more frequently present in the southern hemisphere. And second question, oh yeah, about the latitude, right? So yeah, so that's right. I mean, that's a great point. So in this study, I didn't mention this, but so you see this asymmetry. We're saying that the asymmetry in the hemispherically averaged asymmetry in cloud albedo, okay, is due to this difference here, because these tropical differences cancel out. So they're due to these high latitude differences, right? So to do the study, we focused exclusively on the latitude band 50 to, I think, 65 or 70 in each hemisphere. So it's the same latitudes in both hemispheres. So it's apples to apples in that sense, right? So we're looking at the same latitudes in each hemisphere, okay? And so presume
average comes in southern hemisphere and towards.
So the cloud.
I'm just asking what the statistics or distribution of their location.
Right. So that's this picture, I guess. So there's cloud. So yeah, I mean, the North Pacific kind of ends at 60. So, you know, in the North Atlantic, you have clouds going way up. And here you have clouds going everywhere. But we're saying it doesn't really, I mean, we're taking the same latitude band in each hemisphere to do this study. So we're comparing the same latitude band, right? So, and we're also saying that clouds at other latitudes don't contribute much to the asymmetry. So, you know.
Yeah. Next question. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for that interesting talk. So, when we talk about the Northern Hemisphere storm tracks, recent studies or recent analysis says that the ship tracks just equate over of these storm tracks where the ship's fuel has been changed, and that has brought out some aerosols changes in the Northern Hemisphere. So that will that cause any changes to the albedo in the Northern Hemisphere?
That's yeah, I mean, that's a good question. That's actually a test of the hypothesis, right? So, going the wrong way. So part of the part of the story here is that you have this cancellation in the tropics. Now, if you go and perturb the tropics of one hemisphere in the subtropics in particular, like you're saying, so you go to the northern hemisphere and increase its albedo, that cancellation will no longer apply. So you're going to get a different asymmetry in cloud albedo. So will that break the planetary albedo symmetry? Great question, right? In fact, more generally, aerosol emissions, which are important for the clear sky, but also for the clouds, obviously, have changed dramatically over the past few decades, right? So you've moved from northern hemisphere in the 70s, from the 70s to the 2000s, and moved from North America, Europe to China, India, right? And the composition of the aerosols has changed dramatically. So location and composition have changed, right? And then there's exactly the point you were making about the ship tracks, about the fuel and so there are big perturbations to the aerosol loading in the northern hemisphere. So will that lead? So will the system adjust itself to compensate? And the answer is I don't know, because we wait a few more years, maybe we'll see, and maybe this is a real world test, actually, and like a real world experiment to test the hypothesis of does a mechanism, climate dynamics type mechanism, exist to compensate for any changes in albedo.
Yeah. And one more question in that cloud controlling factor, where you compare the wind speed and the cloud albedo.
Yep.
Yeah, can go back to that. Yeah. So for low wind speeds, I see a systematic decrease in albedo in both the hemispheres, and then it starts increasing. So what could be the reason for the initial decrease?
This little bit here, yeah. The simple answer is I don't know, and the reason I don't know is that the postdoc Joaquin got really interested. He noticed that. He said, "Oh, let's study this," but I said the frequency of these wind speeds is so tiny that you're not don't even look at it. Just stop, don't look at it. You have this amount of time to do this project. You're not going to look at it.
Okay.
So the answer is I don't really know, but anyway, but it doesn't really. It could be just some statistical fluke because the numbers here are tiny, right? So if I put error bars there, if I had put some error bars here, those error bars would be large. So.
Thanks.
Yeah. Next question. There is one question.
What is the time scale response? Like how much time it will take to adjust that from asymmetry to symmetry if we do it in a time?
I mean, I don't know, because I don't even know if it does adjust. So you could do model experiments to look at that, but I mean, we don't even know if it does adjust. So talking of a time scale is would be speculation. I mean, am I understanding your question correctly? You're saying if I perturb the system, how long does it take before the system readjusts?
No,
to-
like so the solar radiance that is like constantly coming, right?
Yes.
And for this cloud albedo to adjust that asymmetry, to make it symmetry, like if I can like make a time scale, like what is the feedback time, like how much?
Well, yeah, okay. So I mean, we don't know if there is a feedback that will compensate, right? So, you know, we don't even know if a feedback exists, let alone the potential timescale that it would have if it did exist. So I can't really answer that question.
Yeah. Any other question? Yeah, you don't seem to consider the land at all in this symmetry asymmetry, because naturally people know, I mean, people expect more land in north and less ocean in, and south is the other way, less land and more ocean. So wouldn't that contribute anything to the symmetry asymmetry?
Yeah, the reason we focused on the ocean was motivated by these results from this paper, in which you see that the cloud albedo over land is like almost exactly the same in both hemispheres. Okay. So if you want to explain the difference in cloud albedo between the two hemispheres, you need you need different albedos, right? And the albedos are only so that, you know, they're over sea ice, that they're also, you know, about the same, depending on how there's a little bit more detail there, but let's just say it's about the same over sea ice. And so the albedos really are only different over the ocean, right? And so the albedo is the difference in the hemispheric average difference in cloud albedo is due in part to the fact that the clouds are brighter in the southern hemisphere, and also that there's more ocean area, right? So those two things contribute, right? But the interest here was to understand why this number is 0.18 and why it's 0.16 here. Okay. To explain the asymmetry in cloud albedo. Okay. The asymmetry in clear sky albedo is largely that's a complete different question, and there the land does contribute a whole lot, obviously, right? For the clear sky. Okay.
In aquaplanet framework, you expect the same thing will be?
So yeah, that's an interesting. So we did that. There was another student who got interested in this and did some aquaplanet experiments. Now, with an aquaplanet, you don't have an asymmetry to start with, right? If it's a pure aquaplanet, right? I mean, there's no asymmetry to start with. So, you know, so to even begin addressing the question, you need to introduce an asymmetry. So what asymmetry are you going to introduce? So what the student did was Aidan Johnson, he put in the key asymmetry was heat energy, ocean energy transport from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere, you know, AMOC, right, which is observed in the modern climate. So he said, okay, let's just look at an aquaplanet and see how ocean heat transport, how that asymmetry, what that will do to cloud albedo, right? Okay, and it's quite interesting because essentially the cooling of the northern hemisphere. Let's see. I'm going to say no. So right. So the cooling of the northern hemisphere due to the ocean That's right. The cooling of the southern hemisphere due to the export of heat by the ocean leads to increased equator to pole temperature gradient, increased baroclinicity, and more cloudiness, actually, right? And then less cloudiness. So it acts to actually reinforce the temperature gradient due to the ocean heat transport itself. But it does give you the right asymmetry in the cloud, right? Actually. So he did actually, do you see what I mean? So that puts you, that leads you to think that the presence of land, the one way in which this coincidence of asymmetry in clear sky albedo and asymmetry in cloud albedo can arise is that you have a bunch of land in the northern hemisphere. This land induces an overturning circulation, okay? And we know this. If you didn't have this land, if you didn't have this oceanic land-ocean distribution that we have, you wouldn't have an AMOC, right? The fact that, well, anyway, so anyway, without making it a long story, the current configuration of continents makes it so that you have an AMOC and then a transport of energy northward throughout the oceans, okay, and that generates an asymmetry in the clouds by, as I just said, okay, because it induces cooling of the southern high latitudes, okay, and therefore bigger baroclinicity and therefore bigger, more intense storm tracks and more clouds, okay? And that compensates for the fact that you put a bunch of land in the north, which has low albedo, right? Do you see what I mean? So at least qualitatively, you can see how a certain continental distribution would lead to opposing asymmetries in cloud and clear sky albedos, okay? Now, that doesn't give you precise compensation, but at least qualitatively it goes in the right direction, okay?
Yeah, one question which may be naive, but among all the variables, why did you think cloud albedo and the wind speed are the right choices of parameters?
Right.
It looks a bit, I mean, there could be even better choices.
Well,
SST cloud, understandable, but
well, we tried all the classic ones that people use. So lower tropospheric stability, EIT.
Or maybe the relative vorticity could have been better to represent something that upliftment or vertical inherent in it. Or why the wind speed? Because they're just scalars. So maybe your intention is the eddies and storm tracks, so that probably the high energy and high cloud. But still, it looks could be more direct variables.
I agree. I mean, there would be a lot. I entirely agree with you. There would be a lot to understand about what is the physics connecting these cloud controlling factors of these clouds. I mean, because this is purely empirical. So I agree. And we haven't done the work, so I don't have a full answer for you. But I can say this, that surface, and these were found just by trial and error. So like you go through the literature, what do people look at? Oh, okay, let's try all of these, and what works turns out to be this, okay? So I can say that there is modeling work for the subtropics, that for cloud top stratocumulus, there is a direct sensitivity to surface wind, okay, because you have more evaporation and therefore a moister boundary layer, and that increases the cloudiness of the cloud top of the stratocumulus, okay. That's quite intuitive, right? I mean, if you evaporate more, you're going to get a thicker cloud, okay. I mean, so that works. So that works in the subtropics, but okay, maybe it works here as well for the low clouds in the subsiding branch of the eddies, okay? And as I said before, the low clouds are a big player here, so that much of the asymmetry is due to the low clouds. So there's a tentative path you could take there. And SST, I don't know, it's just colder, I don't know. I mean,
works well for the tropics, but extra tropics, we don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it could be that these are just proxies for the eddy activity, right? There's not a direct controlling, it's just, these are just proxies for the eddy activity, right?
They do have a relation, obviously.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other question? Otherwise, yeah, Rajiv.
So there is have you noticed any Interannual variability, like because Arctic warming and this thing, so that is changing these factors in the recent years and thing.
Yeah, we haven't looked at that systematically. That's a great question. I did at some point get curious about this and had a quick look, because there is a trend in Southern Hemisphere eddy activity, actually, which is increasing, actually. So I didn't look so much at the Northern Hemisphere, I looked at the Southern Hemisphere. And so the Southern Ocean storm track is actually getting stronger. There's a recent paper that made a big deal out of this. And so then I looked at, and so then so that trend is established in that paper. And then I looked at the trend in the cloud albedo over the Southern Hemisphere. And there is, in fact, a trend, okay, which goes in the same direction. Now, it's a very weak trend, the statistical significance. So for that reason, I didn't pursue it further. But,
Okay, thank you.
More question, and I thank Professor Joy to bring him here, because he is basically visiting Joy at ICER. Thank you, Joy, and for taking the effort. And we thank for a nice talk, and let us give him one big round of applause. And